Welcome to ALC Chats, a podcast series developed and produced by the Ageless Living Collaborative. I'm Phoebe Stein, president of Olive Presents and co-founder of the Ageless Living Collaborative. Ageless Living Collaborative is dedicated to optimizing the lives of seniors and giving them the information and tools to live their best lives. The mission of ALC is to listen, educate, inspire, and influence positive change for seniors and those who support the aging community. ALC Chats is another platform to reach those interested in supporting seniors, be it in senior living or aging in place. ALC Chats comes to you as a podcast and in some cases a vodcast. You can find ALC content on our website, www.agelesslivingcollaborative.org, or by following us on social media channels, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and on our own YouTube channel. Whichever place you follow us, we're happy you've chosen to join us. And now we welcome our featured guest. I'm here with Jane Rohde, principal of JSR Associates and founder of Live Together, Inc. And we are bringing you the first installation of ALC Chats. Today, we're going to talk about intergenerational living, which is one of the many typologies of senior living. Jane, what is intergenerational living?
Hi, Phoebe. Thanks for having me today. So this is one of my passions, as you know, is intergenerational living comes from 30 years of experience of various types of senior living settings simply not working. So we're trying to solve some serious issues here. And so social issues like affordability, staff retention, items and access to services, amenities, and everything from transportation to who do I call when I have a problem? Right. So all those different pieces and parts. And what we have found in the intergenerational models that we've worked on is it can assist vulnerable populations. So it can assist, say, young women aging out of foster care with a child and doing wraparound with other older adults and living in the same community. So that can be one version of an intergenerational community. Another would be developing homes that are modular based, that are more affordable for sale, but they also include an engagement center. That engagement center could have access to recreation, usually food. It's all about the donuts and the coffee. So, regardless. And so if we have those components and then mix that with recreation and then access to care services and amenities, basically we call them a connector or a coordinator of some type, we can usually create a continuum of care by using intergenerational components instead of isolation. We were never really meant to live in one demographic or one age, one ethnicity, one background. We're really meant to live as a community. And so inclusivity for us is really important as part of the intergenerational living models too.
So you use the term wraparound. What does that mean?
So wraparound is kind of, I think of one hand is here's all the people, a little steeple. Here's all the people. On the other side, here's all the other people. And here's the services. And somehow the services and the people don't come together to make the steeple like we did when we were kids. And so part of the problem was that in order to get service that would actually address all the different vulnerabilities at any different point in time, you need to have access to those various folks. So where we really saw this terminology being used in terms of wraparound was like if you have a medical condition, but that medical condition is actually happening because you have mold in your home or bad indoor air quality, or you don't have access to quality food, and that's why your exposure and your immune system has been suppressed. Those are the inconsistencies of the medical system because they look at one single point of time in diagnosis instead of looking at the whole person. So person-centered is where that kind of person-centered comes about too, is that how do we look at that in terms of being able to wrap it around? So it includes not just housing and shelter, but it also includes the services, amenities, and other things that you may need, in addition to the socialization part, right? The isolation that we saw how do you really create a model that allows people to have all the different accesses they need, and then having the assessments by the different people that they need? There's a organization that has been, well, it's not really an organization. It would be more like a modeling, I guess, would be PACE, Program for All-Inclusive Care of the Elderly. It's an adult daycare model that's actually funded through Medicaid and or Medicare, depending on the resident. It can also be private pay. But that model, when you look at surrounding the person with the different services, they do a full bore evaluation of everything from a home visit to their transportation, talking to them and finding out what their needs may be, looking at the medical conditions, evaluating social work issues. So it's really a full comprehensive evaluation of the person as a whole person, instead of trying to single out one attribute of that person and then making a lot of decisions around that one attribute, instead of looking at the person from a multi-attribute perspective, if you will.
So who organizes the intergenerational model? Because it doesn't happen in a traditional senior living setting, such as independent living or assisted living. So how does that get orchestrated and where does it happen?
So that's a great question. And that's why we developed Live Together as an intergenerational component, because it's complicated. So, if something is really super straightforward, we don't believe that the person should flow through the service. We think that the service should come to the resident that when they need it, right? So it's more on demand, if you will. And it also costs less when you do that. So when you don't make an assumption across the board that every single person needs every single service, that's a lot more expensive, right? So we look at it from two components. We look at it from a workforce development component, and how do we evaluate that? And then we look at it from a housing and then access. So we couple the services. We kind of call ourselves the anti-developer because we do it from a grassroots perspective. So if you're looking at it from the grassroots level and you look at a community, we do a mapping to see, okay, what do we have? What don't we have? Then how do we link the services together that are there? And then how do we fill the gaps that are missing? And then how do we couple those together with local jurisdictions? It could be local governments. It could be universities. It could be any other group that also sees the need. And coincidentally, I don't know if it's really coincidental, but the university systems and the students have a lot of the same issues that older adults have. So by coupling those institutions together in terms of what's happening on a university campus often makes a good solution for both older adults and for students and for families. So we look at it as one situation at a time, which I think is why intergenerational is appealing, but it's also a little bit more work, right? In terms of how do you look at this? Because it's not how we've set up society and the senior living industry. So you're really breaking down barriers at the same time you're trying to make things better. So it can take on a lot of different characteristics and it solves different social issues. So you have to kind of link them all together. So we've created a framework. In that framework, we've had different people come to our presentations and say, okay, how do I do this in my community? So we do little pep talks and we give them framework and we give them information and we give them some workforce development, recordings and things like that to utilize for staff development. And so everybody's a little bit different, but they see how it can solve things in their own local community. So that's kind of how we've approached it in terms of trying to get to an intergenerational, I don't know. I'd like to say that it's the norm. I went to a presentation at Environments for Aging, and this guy goes, how many think that it's only going to be intergenerational for the future? And I think him and I raised our hands.
Oh, dear. So, well, I think the concept of it is really cool and it makes all the sense in the world. And I think that it used to be, before we segmented everything, that we naturally lived in a more intergenerational community. But then people started moving away from their families and across the country and across the world, and things changed. So who becomes the matchmaker, if you will, for the people who need to have that type of support in this model? Is there a matchmaker of sorts?
Yeah, there is sort of a matchmaker, but there's also a community identification is kind of what I would call it. And so it's almost like an assessment. So intergenerational can mean different things for different people, right? So one community Roseville. It's out in Oregon. Amazing community. It's just an amazing community. It's well known. It's done some really wonderful things. How they brought in other generations is they actually set up a preschool. I mean, we're not talking just like daycare. We're talking a full-blown preschool with a curriculum and the whole 9 yards, so that children were embedded into their community, use the same garden spaces, go out and play where you can see them, where you can interact with them right in the community. So that's a very valid, excellent intergenerational model. Another one may be that seniors are actually contracted for a lower cost in their rent. They have an X number of volunteer hours that they need to spend. We worked on a community like that in DC, and that fulfilled the need of young moms aging out of foster care with one child needing support. And so how we knew that model was working is at the opening, they had a bulletin board up and, marker board, and it was written on there, "Hi, if you need, help with babysitting, please call me." And then it said, "Better yet, just knock on room apartment 102. And I thought, okay, success, because you realize that they got why they were there, and they chose to be in the inclusive community. And it's not always younger children and older adults. We've worked with older adults that are like, I raised my kids, my grandkids, and my great grandkids. I really don't want to work with little children. And that's valid, right? That's a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it means different things for different people. And I think everybody sees the benefits, because we definitely have research that shows benefits for more than one generation to have access to one another. And then you look at it and evaluate it on different levels and see what the circumstances are, right? And then what does the community need? And if the intergenerational component can fulfill that need, then you actually have a win-win. And so we look at it that way. That's why we have trouble doing affordability, because affordability is all age restrictive, right? So we're like, okay, so what's other methods? So, is it digitally printing a house in concrete, like Dr. Bill Thomas has been working on, or is it modular building? Then they come in as boxes that are prefabbed. Is it smaller square footage? Is it more efficiency? Is it using more community-based service? So if you have a coffee shop across the street, you don't have to rebuild it. And I think that that's kind of been the model, that we have to build everything that we need for this group of people. And in reality, if you can maximize the community resources, then you can reduce the cost and potentially create more of an affordable model that happens to be intergenerational. So it kind of depends on the community.
So you could have an intergenerational model with people residing in different domiciles, be it an apartment building, house, or what have you, and they are still under the live together and intergenerational availabilities and benefits, even though they don't necessarily live down the hall or up or downstairs.
That's correct. And so what we look at is the engagement piece. So what we found was, when we did research, we offered up a program, to a STEM program that was high school students, and they had to do a community project. So we offered up the research project of, what is the intersection between older adults themselves as younger adults, their families, and then underserved youth? What would be the intersection? And we thought for sure the other community challenge was a game. They had to develop a game board and then develop an app and then teach an older adult. We thought for sure the game app was the way they'd go. They didn't. Two of the groups actually selected the initiative about how do they interact, how do people come together. And it was nothing surprising, but it helped us understand the minimum of what you have to have in an engagement center to make it work. And that was some type of dining venue. And it has to be programmed enough so that you meet at least once a month, all of you together, or as many of you together as you can. And so that was one thing that we definitely found. We've seen that successfully happen in Generations of Hope and other types of models. And including Bastion, the Wounded Warrior community that's down in Louisiana. We worked on that as well. That when you have that, and then you have access to recreation, and then you couple that with technology, and often that's reverse mentoring, right? That's the younger kids showing the older adults how to use technology. If you can put those three together and then activate it, then you usually can have a successful intergenerational program. And so that's what we do.
I'm sorry. who is typically that person who manages that? Is that a social worker? Is that a college student? What is the typical kind of point person, if you will, for making sure that all those pieces come together and everybody is getting what they need from that experience?
We find that a social worker works well, but we've also seen LPNs do a really good job with this, licensed practical nurses. And part of that comes out of some work I did many years ago, with a woman who taught me the model. She was a real estate person, and she actually wanted to figure out why people were leaving the apartment, right? So they would leave mid-lease, or they would pay, or something's wrong. She said every single time it was a healthcare issue. It could potentially be like chemical dependency or something like that as well, but it was still healthcare based, or it's taking care of a sick child, or taking care of someone who's disabled, or taking care of a parent. It was almost always a healthcare issue. So when she started putting 2 part-time LPNs on these larger communities, the retention went up in the apartment buildings. It was just multifamily, and it was like B+ apartment buildings. It wasn't anything special, but she was able to demonstrate to the management company, there was this huge management company out of Texas, that she could, for 2 or 3 of those apartments that didn't turn over, she could pay for the services of having an LPN do coordinated care. Wow. So one of the communities we worked on together was in DC. And she went from 18 hospitalizations or deaths in 3 quarters to 1, simply by having 2 part-time LPNs in an indigent poor community that had a very, very high acuity rate, was independent and low income. And it was simply because they weren't getting access to services. Services were on the one hand, people were on the other hand, and they weren't getting connected. So all she did was connect it. And then there was this one man, Mel, he used to carry around a congestive heart failure chart. And I was like, I was like, interesting. I'm so, Mel, what's the story here? He goes, because of this program of having somebody there, when they set up the Meals on Wheels program, because there was definitely a deficiency in getting access to good food, he didn't come out. So they went and checked on him, and he was in failure. He goes, if I had just been living here, normally, he goes, I would have been dead. And so he wanted to tell everybody his story. Another couple, one was eligible for veterans benefits, but he didn't know he was eligible for benefits. And his wife thought she was getting dementia because she was on 15 contraindicating medications, because a plethora of physicians had all given her different prescriptions. So they got her all straightened out, got him his services that he deserved to have as a veteran, had a bed and a caregiver that was actually supported in that. And she said, this saved my life. So when we see those kinds of coordination issues ever since then, and ever since meeting my friend Susan Tuff, that was what has been brewing in terms of, I know this model can work. If you can help the most vulnerable, you can think about economies of scale, how like mid-market, where we're really struggling, how you could do a beautiful job with something like this for mid-market.
When you think about multi-housing, and what the definition of that is, and you think about intergenerational living and how they are very different but could benefit each other, how does one activate a program? Because it can't just be the middle that needs it, or the lower end that needs it. I can't help but think that the upper end needs it just as much, because somebody may well be able to afford to live in a better accommodation, but needs those same services, faces loneliness, needs somebody to look in on them, needs to feel valued. And it's not just at the upper end of your age bracket. It's somebody who could be in their early 30s who feels disenfranchised and could benefit from that intergenerational.
So it's taking the multifamily model, and I kind of stumbled across this by accident. So in one of the communities I went to see in Baltimore, they had done a market rate building, and then they had done redone a senior living building that was a lower income building. And if somebody had to go to Commission on Aging in the department, they would have said, please don't put me in that building because it had just a terrible reputation. So the developer took it over and redid it and opened it up and got daylight and access and all those great things that we talk about from a design perspective, and then had a care coordinator that was there. And then on the corner, they put a market rate small building, thinking that it was going to be students because it's close to an art institute. And I said to him, I go, it isn't students though, is it? It's mostly millennials working and young professionals and about 25% baby boomers. And they go, how did you know that? Because that wasn't what the population was. And it's because we see that in other settings for the same reasons you just talked about, is that the boomers wanted the same thing as the young people wanted. And it also gave them access to more services, more people, and then also a community space that actually was rentable. So in one of the communities we went to in one of the suburbs of Baltimore, they said, yeah, we have this income stream we weren't anticipating. I was like, yeah, really? Because when does that ever happen? And they were renting out the space because they had like a large great room that had a kitchen and all that kind of stuff. They rented it every night for $70. Almost every night, somebody was renting that space to use it to have a gathering, have a birthday party, watch a football game, whatever it might have been. And so as a result of that, the good part about that was that it added a revenue stream. And I was like, okay, so that concierge or coordinator could easily be a part-time person that could have been funded just by using the dollars that were coming in on $70 a night or whatever from the kitty, right? So, and it's kind of similar to when you see a fitness, I think some of this came with COVID too, but when you have a fitness center, they don't usually hire anyone to do the fitness part, but they'll have QR codes for trainers that you can hire.
Right.
So they vet them ahead of time, but then they use the QR code to figure out who the person is. So it's kind of a similar process. And so the more we see this, because anyone can be vulnerable at any point in time, right? So if a younger person has a kid and the kid can't go to school that day because they're sick and they need a sick child care center, they want somebody immediately to be able to tell them where they can take their kid because they've got a big meeting at 10 o'clock that they have to go to. So it's that idea that plugging it into the system. And we also looked at doing it. One of the programs we work with is called At Home Anywhere. It's a program that my friend Marvell Adams has worked on. And the idea is that it's a sliding fee basis and any age can take on the service coordination, right?
That's cool.
Yeah. So that's kind of what we're working on in our demonstration projects, which we don't have one built yet, but we're working on it. Yeah.
So what would you say your age range is for intergenerational? How young, how old, and where does the bulk of it happen?
That's a great question. And it could fall almost anywhere. So two of the projects we're working on right now are more geared towards college students or university students and older adults, and then doing practicum, and then adding a piece of what we call extended care. So a small household for those who may need real, more robust care. Maybe it's because of dementia or Alzheimer's, something like that. So we've been using it as a balance point for the different ages to be able to come together. So if you're in a community that really needs childcare, you put the child care center next to the adult daycare center, and you can have intergenerational programming that way. It really depends on the need and the location as to what the ages are, but they can range from, infants to, 100-year-olds plus, depending on what your focus is and what your demographic is. What I always ask people is, instead of looking at things from a diagnosis perspective in long-term care, look at it from the demographic. Who are you serving? And if you're serving, I'll say 75 to 85-year-olds, right? And that's your primary target market. But then you find out that there's a bunch of single moms that are working and they don't have a place for their kids after school. Right. So start the after school program in the same building with where the older adults live, and then see how that can come to maturity in terms of addressing a social need. So I guess we do it like by layers. It's almost like layering it up one at a time, is that evaluate the community, see how you can implement. It's kind of like doing a strategic plan. We were talking to a gentleman in Bismarck, North Dakota recently. And I go, you've done your strategic plan. Now you have to figure out how to layer in implementation of how we can take what's missing in the community. You provide that. That creates a linkage between your community and the outside community. So that bridges one piece. And then how, as you're solving those different social issues, and they don't necessarily have to be social issues. They could be a healthcare issue. It could be a care issue. It could be almost anything. Then you can see how the different ages kind of fit into it. And it almost happens every time I do this. It almost always happens naturally, and you have to have structure, but
Right. I do find it fascinating that college students are making up a good portion of this, and thinking about why that's happening and why they're opting for that type of an environment as opposed to a more robust college environment, be it, immediate off-campus housing, on-campus housing, and the fact that they prefer to be in an intergenerational. And what is that doing for them? And I'm guessing it gives them comfort. And I think, it's certainly speculation, but I would love to see research on why they choose that model and what it's doing for them to make them feel grounded so that they can be productive.
I can give you an example. So the project we're working on, it actually started with one of the cities in Western Maryland that we were working on. And they were looking for young professional housing. And we said, okay, but you also have retirees that are retiring out of the university system that aren't staying because they don't have access to service. That was why they're leaving. And the students were leaving because there wasn't any affordable places to live. And so they didn't stay because there wasn't any newer housing that they could stay. Right?
Sure.
So we interviewed the students to find out, do you want to stay? And there's always the few that are like, oh, hell no, I'm out. I'm going to the big city. But there's also people who are like, I would like to stay. And this is why my major is what it is. Two women were in gerontology programs with addiction counseling as their other part. And
Perfect.
Go, why? And they said, because we've lost too many family members and friends to the opiate crisis. So really thoughtful young women who I was like, wow. And here, they're in their 20s making decisions that are pretty big life decisions. And they said, we would like to stay here and we would like to work here, but we have to have a place to live in order to do that.
Right.
So that became part of the impetus for looking at one of the university projects we're looking at. And it's a repurpose of an existing building. They needed a place for the new social work department because we were taking it out of another spot, in another area. So we're thinking, okay, let's put the new social work department across from the extended care. That gives them a household. They have a nursing program, a physiology program, and a social work program. They can all do their practicum in the setting of a little bit higher setting of care. So more like a residential assisted living. And then one tower we made student and family housing, and the other tower we made older adults, because it's true that older adults don't want to be up with the 2 a.m. students who might be louder or whatever, right? So it gave them some separation, but also gave them locations to come together. So I don't even know if they would know that they were selecting an intergenerational building per se. They're just selecting a housing solution that works well for them, gives them practicum, and potentially could get them a job when they're done and allow them to stay in the community.
It's amazing. I think that this gives a lot of different folks at various age groups an opportunity to choose something that's a little bit different, that could be immensely enriching, and is not necessarily the standard that you think that a college student or a senior or a single mom is going to elect. And yet it does become a community. And right now, I think people need community more than ever before. So it doesn't matter what age you're at.
And they have something called age-friendly communities, which is actually for, university-based. And then it's university-based senior living is another thing, or retirement communities, RCs, UBRC, I think is the acronym. So in looking at that, there are communities that were actually developed specifically on campuses to work like that, like LaSalle Village up in Massachusetts. And so more and more people are starting to look at the connections between, and we've tried to encourage them that it's not just co-location. It has to have a little bit of programming worked around it, and you've got to fill some of the gaps to then allow that neighboring to happen. Right. It doesn't.
You have to participate in it. You can't just live there. You actually have to participate in that lifestyle because it's really a lifestyle choice.
That's correct.
You've chosen to be part of a multi-generational community, and getting the benefit from that and giving back to that are what is kind of the condition of being there, right?
That's exactly right. And so sometimes we even have them sign an agreement that they agree to X number of volunteer hours. And recently I had somebody tell me years ago that, that only works if there's an affordability monetary connection there. And I found out that that wasn't true at all. I was talking to someone who has a fairly high-end community, and they said, no, we asked for volunteers, and both family members and the retirees were on it. They were like very interested because it gave them purpose.
Of course. And that's what gives them life. If you have purpose, you have life. People are happier. Well, tell me a little bit about how people can get involved. Do they go to live together? Do you direct them? How does that work? If somebody wants to become engaged in an intergenerational community, whether they live in Oshkosh or Tuscaloosa, how do they get involved? Is it through Live Together? Can you help them?
Yeah, sure. So we have Live Together community.org. So it's livetogethercommunity.org is our website. We have advisors. We have things like that. But there's also other folks. So Generations United is the large international, I think, organization that's out of DC. There's surprisingly, a lot of organizations and foundations are actually really interested in this concept of intergenerational living. So the Eisner Foundation is out of New York City. They do work in New York and Los Angeles. They also do some innovation fellowships and things like that. My friend Marvell won the last round. I'm going to apply for this round, just see what happens. So there are organizations that realize that this intergenerational concept is highly important, but also solves so many things. So people are aware of it. But I would think that Generations United would be a really good resource for anyone who wants to just learn more about it. We have workforce development because we think workforce development is coupled with the intergenerational living to create person-centered care and a tipping point. So that would be on our website. We have a little institute that we call it. We have different professionals that have done reportings for us, like around how do you work with folks with dementia and how do you care cue them and how do you work with staff and how do you train staff. We have a perspective of nursing, from a nursing perspective, social work perspective, design perspectives, things like that. There's also some papers on there that how we got going with one of the local colleges where we got a funding stream to help support that. And has worked really well. And that funding stream continues to support pre-development work on projects. So I recently talked to somebody from Windsor, Canada, who had heard one of my presentations, and she was all excited. And I said, I'd be happy to do a presentation for your group. Just let me know. We have a woman named Christine Foster. She's out of Ithaca, the Ithaca area in Cornell, and she's great. We do pep talks, find out how she's doing and what she's doing, and she sees the advantage of how you could foster this with better services, but also access to better housing and design. So she's coming at it from a couple different perspectives.
Sure.
There's a lot of people individually trying to work on it. We've talked with folks. The LeBron James has that wonderful school in Dayton, Ohio. And we've also talked about how Live Together could be a component of that because that's the only component they don't have is aging, right? So, and they've done amazing work with children and amazing work with healthcare services and affordable housing and transient. I mean, they're looking at all the community needs and fitting the niches together. And I love talking with people who fit the niches together, right? Because then they see how everything works living together, right? So,
well, and I love the idea that when you're talking about your living choices, that you're no longer directed to any one type of living situation. Whether you are single, just getting started, still in college, not in college, still just getting started, you're a single parent, you're maybe just somebody who doesn't have anybody else at home, but maybe has your dogs and your cats and you want more people around. It doesn't matter. Whoever you are, it sounds like a intergenerational experience could be beneficial to you for all those reasons. And from the perspective of senior living, I love the idea that there is more than the notion of only aging in place in the home that you live in or going to a prescribed community. You have options. And I think people are always happier when they have more options. And this gives them a tremendous additional option, no matter what their age is.
Yeah, and I think that a good example of that is when we were meeting with the students, we met with one of the students. She was a little bit older student returning to school for her physical therapy degree. And she had a daughter and her mom was a nurse. And her mom worked at night, would pick up the daughter to go to school. The granddaughter, and then the daughter would go to school and then she would go to work and then but if anything fell apart, like if you had one of them got sick or somebody had a doctor's appointment or so, it was such a structured setup.
Right. Then it was a break in the chain.
Yeah, it was gone. So right. I said, so intergenerational living, how do you see it helping? And she goes, just having someone to call or just having a neighbor that you knew was already vetted and talked to about right. them and was willing to babysit or give your child a ride home or whatever it might be. Half day of school, right? Could just totally
it's the missing
off.
link.
Yeah.
It's just the missing link. It's something that keeps the continuum actively moving forward. And it's really special. Well, thank you, Jane, for joining us on our very first podcast. ALC is going to be bringing many more podcast topics to our community in hopes that we provide education around senior living, living with seniors, living in different environments, and much, much more. We are going to also have podcasts coming your way in the near future. So come to our website, agelesslivingcollaborative.org, and check on live events as well as webinars, podcasts, and vodcasts. You'll see when the next one will be featured, and definitely join us on social media. We also make everybody aware of what we're doing on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So you can find us pretty much everywhere. That concludes our first podcast. Again, Jane, thanks for being with us, and we'll see everybody soon.